There is an interesting debate among the people of this country about which powerful special interest has the most clout on Capitol Hill. Some people think it may be Wall Street, and some people may think it's the military-industrial complex, and some people think it's the fossil fuel industry. I myself may be wrong, but I would give the nod to the pharmaceutical industry. This is an industry that has paid $32 billion in fines for a variety of illegal actions over the last 20 years, including price fixing, overcharging the federal, state, and local governments for their products, bribery, collusion, fraud, and deception. And yet this is an industry which keeps going on its merry way, virtually untouchable year after year after year. In fact, I think it's fair to say that it is not Congress which regulates the drug companies, but the drug companies which regulate Congress. And that has got to change.
Welcome back to Outside Counsel. I'm your host, Jeffrey B. Simon. Throughout my career as a trial lawyer, I've been lucky enough to work with and befriend a number of the best trial lawyers in America. My guest today, Randy Johnston, is one of them. Over the course of an almost 50-year career, Randy has tried and won some of the most challenging cases against America's most powerful corporate adversaries. His historic win over the drug company Upjohn in relation to its sleeping pill, Halcyon, made national headlines. He proved to a jury that the drug caused hallucinations that resulted in violence, and did so on behalf of a police officer who, under the influence of Halcyon, had done the unthinkable. He murdered his best friend. In this two-part episode, Randy and I discuss how the civil justice system is on both the cutting edge and the last line of defense to hold corporate wrongdoers accountable when they recklessly hurt consumers, workers, or communities. Randy Johnston, welcome to our show, Outside Counsel.
Oh my God, it's such a pleasure and honor to be here with the author of the most recent book that I read and loved, Last Rites, an attempt to preserve the right to a jury trial. It's a great book.
Brother, you're kinder than I deserve. So in the interest of transparency, you've been a very close friend and great mentor to me for a lot of years. And I guess my question is, how burdensome or wearing have those assignments been for you?
Oh, horrible. I should have charged twice what I did.
Randy, you are one of America's most respected trial lawyers.
Wow, that's you to say.
Oh, it's not a sentiment, it's a fact. And I want to focus your attention and our audience's attention on a case that you tried in the early 1990s against a drug maker, Upjohn, regarding the side effects of a drug called Halcyon.
I've many times said that on my tombstone, it will say he tried the Halcyon case, because after that trial, I was on national television. I was on the front page of every major newspaper in the country. And I went into that with no clue as to how big a deal it was, quite candidly. I was representing Bill Freeman and his family, and Bill was a former police officer, head of the San Angelo District Attorney's investigation unit, and he killed his best friend under the influence of that drug, was convicted of the crime and serving a life sentence when I met him. His defense was self-defense in the murder trial, and there was no self-defense. His best friend was not trying to kill him, as he believed, thanks to that drug.
Wow. So let me break that apart a little bit.
Sure.
You represented a convicted murderer and his
Correct.
family in a case against a drug company, right?
Correct.
Halcyon is what kind of drug? What does it treat?
It's a sleeping pill. I'm going to use words I haven't used in a long time, but learned for that trial. It's a triazolobenzodiazepine. It is one of 4 benzodiazepines that the FDA has ever approved for human consumption in the United States. Halcyon is a sleeping pill. It was the #1 best-selling sleeping pill in the world at the time and represented right at $300 million a year for Upjohn.
What I understand is true is that in 1983, Upjohn brought this sleeping pill, Halcyon, to market. And just 5 or 6 years later, it was the most prescribed sleeping drug in the world and was prescribed in over 90 countries.
I think it was the most prescribed pill in the world of any type at the time. And that is correct. And how it got licensed, how it got into the United States, and what happened to it in other countries is itself an interesting story. But it was a bad drug, and Upjohn was a bad company for how they got that drug into this country.
How did they get this drug to be the #1 pill in America, for example, in just 5 or 6 years?
Some of it had to do with the characteristics of the drug itself. Some of it had to do with a marketing system similar to what we've seen with opioid. Extremely attractive sales reps visiting doctors and persuading them to write more and more prescriptions. But the drug was incredibly popular because it went into the body incredibly fast. So you got quick sleep, and it came out of the body fast. It was like a 4-hour half-life. If you look at a graph of how it comes in and comes out, it just looks like a knife that goes into the body and then comes out. And so you'd wake up with no drug hangover. The problem is you also often woke up with no memory of how you got to where you are. It was a really popular pill for people traveling, flying specifically, because you take it, you sleep all the way to London or Frankfurt or wherever your plane is landing, and then you wake up and you don't have any drug hangover. It ought to be great. Problem is there were lots of fights on airplanes and in airport terminals when people had no idea how they got to where they were.
Wow.
And that's because one of the only side effects that Upjohn ever really even borderline admitted was what's called retrograde amnesia. And so you wake up with no idea how you got there, what you did, who these people are.
Wow. That's in essence a bit like Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia.
That's actually right out of my closing argument. I'm glad you mentioned that because I used Alzheimer's as an example of explaining this to the jury. Because if you, over a period of time, constantly remove bits of the human brain, bits of the memory system in retrograde amnesia, ultimately you end up with a paranoid individual because the world does not make sense to them. And our brain is constantly looking for order and logic. It's the most phenomenal thing. I use 2 examples, if you'll permit me, in my closing. The first was a newborn baby. Newborn baby can be calmed down with the sound of the mother's heartbeat because it learned even in the womb to set up a causal connection between I feel good, I'm well fed, and I'm surrounded and warm and comfortable, and I hear this sound in the background. So you get a newborn, you play that sound, baby calms right down. Problem is that only works for about, I think it's 6 weeks, because that little newborn baby is already smart enough to analyze and reject causal relationships. I'm still hearing that, but my fanny still hurts. I'm still hungry. And the little baby goes, that one doesn't work, and discards that and is no longer comforted. And that's just the way our brain works. Now, you jump to the Alzheimer's patient, or in the case of Bill Freeman and a lot of other people, that very dangerous drug. And the example I used in my closing was an elderly gentleman with those kind of memory issues, likes to drink coffee and read his paper. And he goes out to the front yard, gets a paper, sets it down on the sofa, goes into the kitchen, makes a cup of coffee, and then he goes out to get the paper. And it's not there. And his brain starts looking for explanations. And ultimately, did I pay the bill? I saw the paper boy go by. I know it was delivered. somebody is stealing my paper.
Because that makes sense with that frame of reference.
And that's what Alzheimer's patients do. They become paranoid. Every caretaker of an Alzheimer's patient has, number one, heard them accuse someone else of stealing something from them because they can't find it. And number two, has probably been accused of stealing, because the human brain has got to create order out of something that cannot be made reasonable because there's a piece missing. And that's what that drug did. And it turned Bill Freeman paranoid to the point to where he thought his best friend was trying to kill him. So he killed him first.
Wow. So in addition to causing homicidal ideations, is the drug addictive?
That's a good question. And it has some addictive qualities, but it wasn't thought of as being, I guess I'll answer it this way. There is a significant withdrawal of the drug once you go off the drug, if you've been on it for a long time. But I don't remember reading or hearing or learning anything that it actually had addictive qualities. The problem is people are, of course, addicted to sleep.
Right.
And people who have trouble sleeping, like Bill, he had injured his back in a raid on a trailer house. We always laughed about how stupid it was that he ended up in his situation, because he's showing off for some young cops, and it's a trailer house, and he runs up to bust in the door, not thinking about the fact that trailer house doors open outward, not inward. And this aluminum door flexed and then just sprung him backwards off of the little porch. He landed on his back and had multiple surgeries. His back hurt him up until today, even, I suspect, and he couldn't sleep. And so he was prescribed Halcyon, took it for over 8 years. And that's the real danger of the drug, is the long-term use. You may get in a fight in an airport, but sooner or later you calm down. But if you are constantly, day after day, having little pieces of your brain, of your existence, of your memory stolen from you, then you end up with a paranoid ideation that is very dangerous.
I know you can't discuss conversations with the client because those are privileged, but generally speaking, how are you presented with the idea that you would represent a convicted murderer in a case against a drug company?
Actually, and your point is well made, because I'm always bothered by lawyers who talk about their ex cases, forgetting that it's still confidential information. But Bill authorized me to talk about this at will and his family a long time ago. In fact, I was writing a book for him about the matter, so I have permission to talk about it. There had been lots of incidences involving Halcyon by the time Bill's case came along. There had been some really bad incidences. There had been lawsuits, but it was like from fistfights to murder, and multiple lawsuits filed. The drug industry in general, and Upjohn in particular, used the same law firms and the same legal strategies as the tobacco industry, which included hiding drugs under fake attorney-client privilege claims and medical and trademark claims. And it was like a cookie-cutter defense.
What does that mean?
It means basically that if you're a plaintiff's lawyer, you're going to fight that, you're going to have a hell of a long-term fight.
We can't give you information because that's a protected trademark, ...
Yeah, nothing comes easy. Every request is met with objections and court hearings, and then motions for reconsideration, and then partial compliance and false assertions of privilege that have to be fought. And they just wear you down, and they get witnesses out of the country. We lost an expert witness months before trial. I wish I could remember exactly why, but my memory is they bought him off or threatened him off. And so months before trial, our expert witness is gone, which turned out to be a blessing. There's a great story there. But the bottom line is, all of these cases around the country, they're paying nominal settlements to people after they have beaten them into submission because the plaintiff's lawyers couldn't afford the fight. And then a case in Utah comes along, a woman whose name I no longer remember, killed her mother. Very similar circumstances to Bill's long-term use of the drug. She was indicted for murder. They heard that she was going to assert the defense under the drug, unlike Bill. And so the state of Utah demanded access to all kinds of documents from Upjohn about the drug, the testing, the effects, all of the background information on the drug. And they got it, and they dropped the charges. They would not prosecute the woman. And a lawyer whose name I don't remember managed to get access to either to the template or to the actual documents, I don't remember which, from the state of Utah. And he filed a lawsuit. And that's the first time that Upjohn's dirty laundry was out and in the hands of a plaintiff's lawyer. They ultimately settled with her for a couple of $1 million, we were told. Extreme confidentiality, will kill you if you ever say anything kind of thing. She was scared to death to talk to us, as was her lawyer. But my good friend Mike Mosier, who was Bill's first wife, was Mike's former legal assistant. And so she came to Mike, and Mike started looking into it. I don't know how he did it, but Mike got the template of the discovery that the state of Utah sent, and then that this plaintiff's lawyer sent when he got the documents and put the story together of how bad this drug was. So Mike just duplicated it. And Mike is a solo. I think his practice is still in Paris, Texas. They viewed him as a small town lawyer, small town plaintiff's PI lawyer, but that's not who Mike was. Mike's a former, I think, Kay Schooler lawyer from New York City, top of his law school class, who decided that isn't what he wanted to do. They were dealing with lawyers just as smart and as motivated as their crappy tobacco lawyer defense team. And Mike just followed the breadcrumbs until he had the full story. So they're going to go to trial. And Mike came to me pretty much after he had fully prepared the case and asked me if I would help try it, because he knew he was going to be overwhelmed at trial with Baker Botts and Shook Hardy Bacon as both firms handling the defense. So I got into the story very late. Mike did all of the hard work. I got to be the mouthpiece at trial and get a lot of the publicity and credit. But the real work on that case was done by Mike. I'll tell you another thing, Jeff, that made that case possible is the court it landed in. And that was Judge John Marshall, the 14th District Court of Dallas County. And Judge Marshall was infamous among lawyers. He's very mercurial. He had his own set of rules. He timed everything at a time before other judges were restricting the amount of time lawyers used on their cases. But he also had his own sense of justice and fair play. And sometimes that worked to our benefit, but sometimes it didn't as well. But he was not the least bit intimidated by big law firms or big companies, and he enjoyed poking them a little bit. And so I don't know that any other judge would have been willing to listen to the 10 or 20 motions to compel the same document that he did and preserve their rulings the way he did. But he wanted this case to go to trial, and so he gave us the discovery and he made them produce it, and we're looking at a trial date, and then we lose our expert witness. So if you'll permit me, I'll tell that story very quickly. I am a firm believer that the best trial lawyers, like you and like some of the lawyers in the dedication to your book, are just really creative people. Certainly the plaintiff's lawyers are, because it's so hard to win as a plaintiff. People think when they see these big judgments, they come so easy, and they do not. But we lost this expert witness who was the traditional expert witness, a doctor who had epidemiological background involving drugs and testing, and the very kind of doctor they were going to have testify to the opposite. And my memory is they made a deal with the university where he taught and gave him a bunch of money, and then said, but you don't get this if you're going to testify against us. And so they killed him. They just cut off his access to us. So we went out and hired a doctor here locally, a forensic psychiatrist who euphemistically was known as Dr. Death, James Grigson. was a forensic psychiatrist who testified for the Dallas County District Attorney's Office all the time in death penalty cases. So I thought, if we can't get, and at that last minute, if we can't get a epidemiologist who knows all about drug testing, let's get someone who knows all about murderers. And Dr. Grigson is a highly skilled, part of his resume is, I've interviewed more murderers than any human being in the history of the world. And it's a true statement. So it was, and he's a phenomenal testifier. Juries love him. He's charming. He's been cross-examined by the best criminal defense lawyers in the world. So he's not afraid of anything, and he doesn't back down. And so he was willing to testify. Look, I look at this guy and I look at his act, and they don't go together. So what explains it? Here's a drug. That is the reason he did it. Now, today, with the changed rules on expert witnesses, I'm not sure we could get that testimony in, because the Supreme Court of both state and the U.S. has restricted access to expert witness testimony pretty severely. And it's much, much harder to prosecute a case against a drug company today than it was then. It was hard then. Today, it takes hundreds of thousands of dollars of lawyers' money on a contingent fee to prosecute these cases. And we were on a budget. So Dr. Grigson carried the football for us. He did a great job, by the way.
Today, you would need that epidemiologist. The case would have been over without it. You would have had to have somebody say, I have a PhD in epidemiology, as well as either a PhD in pharmacology or in psychology, or a medical degree in psychiatry. And I can tell you that based on the study of disease in populations, the increased risk at that dose level is at least double the risk, blah, 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 blah. And that would have cost you $500,000.
Oh, at least. At least. And here's the thing, Jeff. Among the things that we found, you're going to love this with what you... I assume no one watches your podcast who doesn't already revere and respect you as a trial lawyer, but I want to say how much
you'd be surprised.
And defense lawyers who have to deal with you. But I respect so much what you have done for so many hurt people over the year. That's not most of my practice. This was an aberration for me, but you do it day in and day out. But this was among the things that we found. You're just so going to love this. We got copies of one of the 2 or 3 studies that they submitted to the FDA to get this drug approved in the United States. And then we got copies of some secret FDA documents where they were saying this doesn't look quite the way we normally expect epidemiological studies to look. For example, here's this one study out of Arkansas, and there's 100 patients who took the drug, and there's an incredibly low placebo effect. It doesn't fit what we would expect. And they looked a little closer at the sign-in sheets, and they said, all of these people signing for this drug looks like they have the same handwriting. And so they go down and question the doctor who was doing it for Upjohn, being paid to submit this report. And he said, all of these people are related, and they all went to the same school, and they all had the same teacher who all taught them how to write. So that's why their handwriting is all the same. Oh my God. So the FDA then went out, and this was buried by Upjohn. The FDA went out and interviewed the people. None of them knew anything about the doctor. None of them had ever come in, taken a single drug. It was all falsified. And the general public who might be disinclined to say, oh, we should have a jury trial over whether or not a drug is safe. It's just you trial lawyers. We trust big government. We trust big companies. There are things in place, and our government is too big. We don't need government having all these regulations. This is the crap you get if you don't have enforcement at a level that really protects people. It was just so outrageous. The drug had been kicked off the market in London. I think in the Netherlands, they kicked it off the market, and they were just fighting like crazy to keep it on the market here. Oh my God, Jeff, here's another thing they did. always get pissed off at everything, but this pissed me off so much. If I were a violent man, I would have been inclined to violence. During our trial, while we have a jury out, Upjohn goes back to the prosecutors in Utah and gives them new data to try to get them to re-indict that woman so they can put it into evidence in our trial and ruin her life. After they've paid her $1 million, they seal her up so she can say nothing, but it was unilateral. They could talk about her all they wanted.
How did that turn out?
The state refused to do it. Number one, the data, God, they had just crapped in their own mess kit so completely with these falsified studies. I can't even imagine the chutzpah, the pride, the arrogance that it takes to ask someone to trust your documents after you've done that knowingly and then defended it and got caught, then say, forget about that. We really are good people. Here's some more. What a crock of horse manure.
During jury selection, where your job includes the need to find jurors who can't be fair to your client and therefore ask the court to excuse them for bias, or failing that, use one of your few peremptory strikes on them. Did you have jurors who said, I can't consider your case fairly when you're suing a drug maker on behalf of a murderer?
It was more the latter. Nobody, I guess today with the much greater publicity over opioid and the more public television ads for drugs, it might be different. But back then, no one really knew about Upjohn, didn't even know their name. There's probably 5 or 10 people who knew Halcyon and had used it. But the real problem was, how do I get a jury who's not going to hold it against my clients because my client's serving life for murder?
Right. And were there jurors who said, I'm not awarding money to a murderer, irrespective of whether there's some merit to your case?
In fact, that's not only what some of them said they could and then didn't. I should add here, jump ahead for the moment. We won this trial. They found that the drug was defective, inadequate labeling, and awarded $2 to $3 million total, including punitive damages. I don't remember the exact numbers. One of the things, I don't do this very often, but I still have a trial notebook. I still have the court's charge right here, because I've always expected Upjohn to come back and sue me for defamation. So I'm prepared. I keep my exhibits if they're inclined to. But we asked, can you award damages to a murderer under any set of facts? And we struck a few, and those who stuck around said they could. My closing argument ran out of time right when I was talking about Bill's damages. And the Judge Marshall would not let me go on, just set me down and shut me up.
Wow.
And that may be my fault for not managing my time as well as I should have. But I was just prepared to say, look, this is about Bill's family. Bill is going to serve his time in prison. You can't change that. He is wrongly there. You can't change that. Money doesn't mean that much to him. You give him $5,000. He's a rich man in Texas, Department of Corrections in Snyder, Texas, in the prison there. He can buy Cokes. He can buy razors. He can buy cigarettes. He's got a commissary balance that makes his life tolerable. And that's all we want for him. The family is the one that needs the damages and should have the money. But I didn't get to say any of that. I just said, let me talk about Bill's damages here. And I started to say, I have all my life tried to imagine the worst situation possible and then what I would do to deal with it. When I was a kid, I used to imagine what would happen if a lion was going to eat me. And I would stick my arm down the lion's mouth and gag it and then use the other one to poke in its eye, and it would let me go. And I said, I've imagined a lion after me. And the judge said, that's enough, counsel, sit down. So the jury awarded Bill $0 and $2 million to the family. And that $0 award for Bill became the justification for the Court of Appeals to throw the whole thing out. So I didn't make any money on this case, but it's one of two cases I am most proud of over my entire career, because there are 4 kids who now know their father was not a murderer. And that means more to me than any amount of money I might have gotten out of it.
That's an incredibly important sentiment. And
I get choked up thinking about it all over again. I'm always amazed, and you do your podcast. I think you asked me before we did this, like, what's one of your most memorable cases? And so I've started asking lawyers that, Jeff, and I'm always amazed. They fall into 2 categories, and it's not strictly plaintiff defense, although one sees a little bit of a pattern, I'll admit. One category is lawyers who say, oh my God, I had this trial where this guy said X, Y, Z, and he fell in my trap, and I came back with the exact right question, but isn't it true that? And I look like a hero in that courtroom, in the drama of the courtroom. And we all have some stories like that, but that's basically saying your most important, your most memorable experience as a lawyer is about you.
Gratifies you.
Yeah.
In terms of ego or ambition.
And then there's another group of people, and I'm not trying to pat myself on the back here because this is true of me as it relates to the Freemans and the other case. There's a group of people who say, oh my God, I handled this case for a client and I made a difference in that client's life. As a plaintiff's lawyer, that's an incredibly good feeling. I made a difference in my client's life. And this is a case where I know I changed the life of those 4 children.
You also affected the jury. In your opening statement in the case, you told the jury, my prediction is this case will fundamentally change the way you feel about business, government, and our courts when you're through here. What did you mean by that?
I was addressing the very thing that we talked about a little earlier. And again, I'm going to say the thing you talk about in your book a little bit, which is people's false presumption that things are just fine, that we shouldn't have lawsuits. We have too many lawsuits. Only bad people file lawsuits. You don't need lawsuits. Big companies are not bad. They're trying to make money. The capitalist system works. And that's what I was addressing. This case is going to make you question every prescription you get from a doctor, every label on the prescriptions that you get, every time a big corporation tells you something about their product, every time you hear something about the court system that suggests that it's not a fair place, this case is going to teach you the falsity of all of that.
You had a 12-person jury.
Right.
In Texas, 10 jurors have to agree on every question to render a verdict. How many voted to find Upjohn partially responsible for why Bill Freeman killed his friend?
We had a 10-person verdict because there's always some people who just have the slightest little misgivings that could be brought over to your side of the case. But as soon as 10 agree, they don't have to, so they can stand by either their doubt or their high moral principle or something. This was the proverbial 10 of 12.
My understanding from news reports is that the jury found that Upjohn, the drug manufacturer, was 20% responsible for the death, that the prescribing physician, Bill Freeman's doctor who put him on Halcyon, was 30% responsible, and that Bill Freeman himself was about 50% responsible. Is that right?
That is true on the negligent claim. We had a negligence claim and the traditional product liability claim. And on the negligence claim, they found 50% on Bill, 20 on Upjohn, and 30 on the prescribing doctor.
I can just tell you from one trial lawyer to another that you and Mr. Mosher did a hell of a job in convincing a jury that a convicted murderer in the penitentiary was only 50% negligent for the death then caused.
I'll
That is
accept that.
that is a piece of lawyering, my friend.
I'll accept that.
So the verdict comes in. Just in that moment, how did you feel about what the jury had rendered?
It's been 30 years and I still do not, my life, my craft is words, and I do not have the words to describe it, Jeff. But let me try. So we get a call. I think it's like the next day, may have been 2 days, but my memory is it was the next day. My memory is it was a Friday. I think Marshall calls us like Thursday night, or the clerk calls and says, we got a verdict. Judge is not going to unseal it until tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock because he wants all the news media to have time to get there. I'd tried this case. I'd watched the cameras out over my back shoulder at the door, filming through the little glass panes in the door, and run the gauntlet of cameras in and out for a few days. During the middle of this, went on for 6 weeks. During the middle of the trial, they went away, but they filtered back towards the end. Closings were all big doings. And so I figured they would be around, but I'm walking into the courtroom 100% satisfied with our case, remembering all of the home runs and singles and doubles I hit, and all of the pitches we threw that they whiffed or we turned against them somehow. Not that we didn't take a few blows, because we did. And so I walk into the courtroom and we're sitting there, seems like forever. And the jury is sitting there as well. Marshall is not on the bench yet. It was speculated that there was one news network hadn't arrived yet, but I am sitting there, and I'm standing. We're standing at counsel table, and I'm talking with Mike. And it was the first moment, Jeff, where I thought to myself, what if I lost?
It didn't occur to you before that you might lose.
It never occurred to me that I was going to be standing there having lost a case that was going to be on national media. And it's, oh crap, how did I get into this?
Right.
Why did I do this? What was I thinking? I went through the biggest, like 10 minutes of self-doubt. I've disappointed this family. I've ruined my career. No one will ever hire me again. Ironically, because when I took the case, I thought, there's no downside to this case. Mike's done all the work. It's not going to take me that much time. And if I just come in and try it, no one will ever blame me because I didn't file the case. I didn't prepare it. I did my best. No one will care. All of a sudden, I knew somebody, by God, would care. And I had been the face of the plaintiff's case. I was scared to death waiting on that verdict to be read. And when he read the negligence findings first, 50, 20, 30, I thought, we didn't lose. It's not a big victory, but we didn't lose because it was only 50%. One more percent, we would have lost it all. And then he read the product liability finding. Do you find that the product was defective? Yes. My knees just buckled. I almost fell into my chair. It's like I had to tighten every muscle I had to stay upright because the joints were no longer functioning. And then he got down and started reading the numbers. I was trying at first to keep track of them and add them up and see how big it was. And I thought, I don't even care. The fact that there's a number there is all I care about. So then I slowly got my composure. I walk out of the courtroom. I'm in an altered state of consciousness. I've had lots of good victories and losses in my career. I've never experienced this again. It's like I was floating up above, watching myself. I did not know who I was. My partner at the time, Bruce Budner, was having, I think, his 30th, maybe 40th birthday dinner that night at his house. And I went, probably 40th. Yeah, it would have been 40th. And I went over to his house and everyone is congratulating me. And, oh, you did such great. I saw you on the news. I'm just in a trance. It's like I'm on some drug that has just caused me to retreat back into this cloud And the magnitude of what I had done for this family obscured everything else around me. It was the strangest feeling I've ever had following a trial.
You felt so strongly that real justice had been done that it almost was an out-of-body experience?
Yeah, it was an out-of-body experience. And especially when it was like on the tails of that experience, standing up in front thinking, oh my God, I could have lost this case. Because my other most memorable case involved Navy SEALs, I often think that it's like a Navy SEAL looking over a hill and saying, oh my God, there's 500 of them. Why did I come up this hill? And then all of a sudden, all 500 of them just fall over dead. The juxtaposition of those two things, I've never had that kind of discrepancy in my consciousness before.
Thank you to my guest, Randy Johnston, and thank you for tuning in. Join us next time for my two-part conversation with Randy, where we dive into the aftermath of his landmark trial against the drug giant Upjohn. This podcast is produced by Shannon McDees of Revel and Convey and Larry Shavana. The opinions expressed on Outside Counsel are neither legal nor medical advice. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers, guests, experts, and/or host. They do not expressly nor necessarily reflect the opinion of any institution with which I am or ever have been a member and should never be attributed as such. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Outside Counsel. I'm Jeffrey B. Simon.